Some of the most insightful and interesting observations have been made by mass murderers. We think men such as Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin have nothing to teach us, but they do. It is estimated that Joseph Stalin murdered about 10 million of his own countrymen. Yet, he said some things we should consider for a moment as we look to understanding the cost in blood and treasure of the American Civil War. Stalin said this, quote, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic," close quote. His point is pretty basic. Since we cannot comprehend the death of a million or a 500,000 people, their deaths are only a statistic, essentially meaningless. We need to take a few minutes to wrap our minds around what 630,000 Civil War dead really means. Since I am a Dodger fan, let's begin with Dodger Stadium. What is the first thing you notice when you walk into Dodger Stadium for the first time and you see the lower, middle, and way upper decks, and you see the sweeping panorama of the ballpark and the crowds encircling even the entire outfield? Here is a picture taken from up in the stands behind home plate. Here is the wall of people down the third base line and into left field. This is the first base line and the right field line and the other side of the stadium. Here is a movie taken of the entire stadium when it is empty. Clearly, Dodger Stadium holds a lot of people. But how many people does Dodger Stadium actually hold? Give me a drum roll. A little over 50,000. So how many Dodger stadiums could be filled with the dead of the American Civil War? If the numerator is 630,000 and the denominator is 50,000, we can cross out 4 zeros in both the numerator and denominator, and that gives us 63 divided by 5, or nearly 13 Dodger stadiums. Many more Americans died in the Civil War than any other war. In fact, it would take 27 Dodger stadiums to equal the number of dead in all our wars in our history. But nearly half of those were Civil War dead. The casualties are even greater when you include the mothers and fathers who were told they would never see their sons again. And when you include the wives and sweethearts who were told that the man they loved would never return. These are the men these women were planning to build a life with. This is a picture of soldiers returning from Afghanistan. Except for the uniforms, it could be World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, or the Civil War. What about the sons of these dead soldiers who would never know the loving hand of a father guiding them into manhood? Or the daughters who would never have a daddy give them away at their wedding? The simple fact is that when you consider those who lost arms and legs and were crippled, and those who suffered from psychological stress disorders, and you include the family members, the casualties of the American Civil War were in the millions. One of my favorite observations was by someone who pointed out that Americans fought the Civil War so we could become the kind of nation who would wonder how we could ever have fought the Civil War. War causes nations to bleed red and green. Another way of saying blood and treasure. How much treasure did the Civil War cost this nation? Well, in 1861, our national debt was $65 million. By 1865, at the war's conclusion, our national debt had ballooned to $2.7 billion, 42 times greater than before the war. And that's only the Union debt. It does not include the money spent during the war by the North or the South, or the destruction of so much of the South's infrastructure, such as the railroads, and the depletion of their capital resources. It took the South over a century after the Civil War to achieve economic parity with the rest of the nation. Both Southern whites and blacks were economically devastated after the Civil War. It has been said that the blacks came into freedom with nothing but freedom. But think about this. If you took all the money spent on the Civil War by both sides and the value of all the property destroyed and total it up, not only could all the slaveholders have been compensated for their slaves with $2.4 billion, but with what was left over, every slave family could have been given the mythical 40 acres and a mule, which is an amount considered sufficient capital for subsistence farming. And there would still be enough money left over for educating the former slaves and paying off the national debt in 1861. In other words, if the cost of the war had been known beforehand and the war avoided, everyone could have been compensated for their losses with enough left over to largely protect free men from exploitation. Americans, both then and now, have tried to find meaning in the war's aftermath, but at its core, the American Civil War was truly a national tragedy, and there is no getting around that. There is another cost to the Civil War, more difficult to quantify than lives or treasure. The explosion in technology, science, industry, and mass production had begun elevating the lives of Americans tremendously the first half of the 19th century. The quantity and quality of our food was quickly improving. Canals, railroads, steamboats, and telegraph lines were improving our lives immeasurably. The Civil War was the first war where this modern technology was untethered from the commitment to improve American lives and instead harnessed to engage in acts of cruelty and spread death in numbers unimaginable in 1860. Here's a photograph of the dead after the Battle of Antietam. Here's a photograph showing the destruction of the Atlanta railroad yards after Sherman burning Atlanta. After this, Sherman marched his army through South Carolina, where secession had begun, with the express purpose of making them feel the hard hand of war. Here is a photograph of the capital of South Carolina, Columbia, which was largely destroyed by the Union Army. As good as we were at applying science, technology, industrial power, and mass production to peace, the Civil War taught us that we were even better at applying these things to war. Along with applying science to modern warfare, the Civil War was the first war waged against civilian population centers, a lesson studied and embraced by Europeans 49 years later in World War I, where the death toll exceeded 16 million. 10 million soldiers and over 6 million civilians. Enough to fill Dodger Stadium 320 times.